We're here with Piper Kerman, author of the memoir, Orange is the New Black, My Year in a Woman's Prison. Her best-selling memoir inspired the popular Netflix series. Thank you for being with us. You've used your experience of 13 months in a women's prison as a platform for dialogue on reforming our criminal justice system. What is your message for state lawmakers?
My message for state lawmakers is that they need to seriously reconsider our reliance on incarceration in prisons or in jails as a way of solving problems in the community. Problems like substance abuse and addiction, problems like mental illness, and a host of other things that we sort of inappropriately respond to with confinement in prisons and jails. Many of these social problems, which are very serious, and we do have to figure out the ways that we want to address them, putting people in prison for those things simply doesn't work. Those problems are not addressed by confinement. And when an offense, when a crime or public disorder is driven by those problems, we need to find better responses than relying on the criminal justice system to fix things that it simply cannot do.
So what part or parts of the system do you advocate reforming, and how and why?
It's really important to think about criminal justice reform as a system. In other words, there's no sort of noodling around with prisons that's really going to yield us, this substantial return. We have to think about policing, courts, corrections, and reentry as this systemic factor and systemic approach. And so we really need to think about both the beginning, the middle, and the end of those processes. So we've seen in the states like New Jersey and New York, which have reduced their prison populations by at least 23%, with even bigger reductions in violent crime. We've seen that they addressed sentencing, they addressed parole in terms of reforming parole systems, and they thought about ways to divert people out of the criminal justice system, like drug courts. And those are some of the ways that they so successfully reduced their prison population by big numbers with no impact on public safety.
So can you comment on how these reforms support a system that is cost-effective, but while also holding offenders accountable and protecting public safety?
Holding individual people accountable for their transgressions against the community, or if they victimize other people, is very important. I pled guilty to my offense, when I was indicted, and owning up to the harm that I caused was a very important part of my own experience. That said, thinking about prison or jail as the only way to hold a person accountable is probably a big mistake, just because we know the costs of incarceration, whether you're talking about the economic costs or the social and human costs, are very, very great. And so we have to think about what accountability return are we really getting when we lock somebody up? I think one of the biggest areas that we need to invest more attention and care is thinking about accountability measures in the community, which work. There's a program in New York called Justice Home, in which women who are looking at least a year in prison or jail are given an opportunity by their district attorney and their judge to be held accountable at home in their community. And the other thing that program, Justice Home, does, it makes sure that those women get substance abuse help, mental health help, parenting help. There are different things that different individuals need, in addition to the accountability measures that the prosecutor and judge make sure happen.
You were subject to a mandatory minimum sentence for a drug crime, but through a plea agreement, it was reduced. Can you talk about how mandatory minimums have shifted discretion from the sentencing court to the prosecutor, and what the broader implications of that are for the offender in the system?
There is a great deal of consensus that the experiment with mandatory minimums has not been a very successful experiment, particularly when it comes to drug offenses, but not only when it comes to drug offenses. And that's because it really concentrates power in the hands of one player in the justice system, which is the prosecutor, and robs judges of much of the discretion and the ability to apply their wisdom to sensible sentencing. And it also really poses a problem in terms of robbing sort of the Sixth Amendment rights of defendants, because defense attorneys have far less ability to successfully advocate on behalf of their client. Mandatory minimum sentencing has sent millions and millions of Americans to prison and jail and has saddled far more Americans with a felony record. The truth of the matter is, especially when it comes to drug sentencing, those drugs are cheaper and they're more readily available and they're more potent than they were when we put those laws on the books. So those mandatory minimum sentences have not succeeded in reducing substance abuse and addiction in our communities.
Women are one of the fastest growing categories of prisoners, and your book and the Netflix series examine the role of mothers who are incarcerated. What are the unique challenges that women face in prison, and what can or should be done to address those challenges?
We know that the factors that influence women's involvement in crime and their incarceration are significantly different than what is true for men. Three things drive women's involvement in crime and their incarceration, and that is a high incidence of mental illness, a high incidence of substance abuse and addiction, and a shocking degree of experience of sexual abuse or other physical abuse prior to their incarceration. So those kinds of traumas are the things that lead to women being involved in crime. And those traumas are really important in consideration of how the criminal justice system should hold women accountable and rehabilitate them. Because too often, the prisons that we lock women and girls away in actually only make those traumas worse. And that's a real problem because women come out of prison in worse shape than they went in.
Okay. You described the tribal nature of prison and how that can both intensify racism and at the same time be helpful, especially for the newly incarcerated. From a public policy perspective, are there disparities that can or should be addressed?
The data shows that there are huge racial disparities in our criminal justice system. Ironically, we expect that every American will be treated equally in a court of law, but when we look to the criminal justice system, we see very clearly that not all Americans are being policed equally, they're not being prosecuted equally, and they're also not being punished equally. I often say that the most unusual thing about my story is not that I committed a crime. It's the fact that I was policed and prosecuted and ultimately punished with prison. Too often, we reserve those things for poor communities and disproportionately for poor communities of color. From a moral perspective, this is one of the most important reasons that government must do things differently, because all Americans need to have confidence that everyone is treated the same in American courts of law.
Okay, well, you just touched on this, but my next question is, as a middle-class, college-educated gal, you don't meet the typical prison demographic, which is part of what makes your story so compelling. Does one's socioeconomic status make her any more or less prepared for prison life?
We know that 80% of people who are accused of a crime are too poor to afford to hire a lawyer to defend them. And that's a real problem because we know that that doesn't actually map to who commits crimes. You know, a far greater number of middle-class people, you know, may in fact break the law, but they're much less likely to be held accountable than poor people. I entered prison with a history which included a safe and stable place to live. It included a very good public education, and then I was fortunate to be able to go to college. And so even though a correctional system can take away every single stitch of clothing you have, They can never take away your education. They can never take away, you know, the 10 years of professional experience I had prior to entering prison. When I left prison, I had all of those advantages to draw down on to make my return to the community successful. Most of the women that I did time with did not have those opportunities that I enjoyed prior to entering prison, and that's also true for men. We have to look at things like educational deficit and big opportunity gaps when we think about the front end of the system, when we think about policing and prosecution and sentencing. We have to think about all of those other systems of government which, when they don't work well for low-income Americans, the chickens come home to roost in the criminal justice system.
How has going from an average American kid to an inmate to a best-selling author and nationally known figure affected your perspective on life?
Interesting question. The very first day in prison, I immediately recognized that the experiencing I was having, you know, as a nonviolent drug offender sent to prison, you know, 10 years after committing my offense, was not this sort of unique thing that was just happening to me. It was something that was happening to millions and millions of other Americans. And it had happened to, you know, roughly 200 women who I would be living with in incredibly close quarters for the next year. My story is interesting to others because it helps put in context this American experiment with mass incarceration, which I think across the political spectrum, people are recognizing has not really gone well for us as a community. I think that personal stories and the perspective of people who have been through the criminal justice system are very important if we want to understand how we can do a better job. I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to share my story, and that story has proved relevant to lots of other people. I think that is what I hoped for when I wrote the book.
Is it worth investing in women who make up such a small percentage of the incarcerated overall?
Women tend to be, you know, no more than 7% of correctional systems in terms of women who are locked up in prisons or jails. But women's pathways into criminal activity and into incarceration are significantly different, and their success in terms of reentry and coming home successfully is also predicated on different things. We call appropriate responses to this gender responsive policy or programming, and it gets much better results with criminal justice involved women and girls. Washington State is the first state to adopt completely gender-responsive programming and policy in their correctional system, and they deserve huge amounts of credit. There are many other states which have adopted some kind of gender-responsive approaches in terms of their correctional systems. So this is really where things are going. But it's exceptionally important to be persuasive to departments of corrections that they need to recognize that 6 or 7% of their correctional population needs really different kinds of interventions and really different kinds of treatment in order to be successful.
Thank you so much
Thank you
for being with us today.
Oh, absolutely.